all wars are about winning the peace.
Yeah.
Wars are generally a miscalculation. They generally don't turn out the way people hope or expect. They rarely deliver the advantages that the people who start them think. But it's not the war per se, it's the peace that you should focus on. So, for example, the United States in Afghanistan won the war, but then we lost the peace. I think it's pretty clear. We ousted the Taliban really quickly.
Yep.
We helped an alternative Afghanistan political system form. But in the fullness of time, the Taliban came back and we lost the peace. Iraq is a little bit more ambiguous. We certainly won the war. Looks like we lost the peace, although the fullness of time we'll see. In Vietnam, the United States lost the war and it won the peace.
Yeah.
Vietnam is a remarkably pro-American country, as you know, despite the atrocities that the Americans committed there. And so that's really interesting. You can not only win a war and lose the peace, you can lose a war and win the peace. So kind of how do you win the peace in Ukraine?
Yeah.
That was my question early on. I understand that we need to talk about the war, and I have talked about the war, but what about after the war? Is there an after the war, and what should it look like? And therefore, how should we define victory in the war if our goal is to win the peace? So what's a better definition of victory? I think we can talk about the peace or a victory as Ukraine getting into the European Union, and Ukraine getting some sort of security guarantee. Why does Ukraine need to get into the European Union? Well, because it needs that mechanism of European Union accession to transform its domestic institutions, to go from a poorly institutionalized, weakly institutionalized, extremely corrupt state to more like a European state with rule of law, open society, free and open media, and prosperity. Because Ukraine is remarkably poor by European standards. Okay. And then security guarantees so that Ukraine, if they rebuild, it then isn't destroyed again. What might that EU accession process look like? What might the security guarantee look like? I think those are worthy of debate and need to be debated, and they are being debated. So that's very positive. But to get to that road, you need an armistice.
Yeah.
You need the fighting to stop. Meaning, you don't need to get all of your territory back in order to start the process of European Union accession, transformation of institutions, rebuilding the country in a new economy and with some security arrangements, right? It would be better if you got your territory, but it would be much better if you started the process with an armistice of gaining a Ukraine that the Ukrainians need. And so getting however much of Ukraine you can control and transforming it into a European country, joining the West is how we would put it. So that, I think, means how do you get an armistice? How do you get to that point where you can start that process? That's a better definition of victory, and that's how you win the peace. So if you look at the Korean Peninsula, of course, it's a very unsatisfactory outcome. Yeah. It's only an armistice. Yeah. It's not a peace treaty. Yeah. They're technically still at war. Yeah. But there's not large-scale fighting. And yes, North Korea does a lot of things that the South Koreans regard as provocations. And so it's unsatisfactory. But still, on the other side of that demilitarized zone, with the American security umbrella, in the absence of a peace treaty, they got an American security umbrella. They built or rebuilt one of the most successful societies on the planet, as you know, South Korea. It's unbelievably impressive what they did. Yeah. Again, it's not perfect. It's not satisfactory. It would have been much better to get a peace treaty.
Better than nothing.
But hey, look what they've achieved. Yeah. And so an outcome like that for Ukraine would be a miracle and would be a gift and would not necessarily involve Ukraine acknowledging loss of territory, right? South Korea doesn't acknowledge that the Korean Peninsula is divided forever. Quite the contrary. But in the meantime, they rebuild. Right now, what's on the table for a security guarantee of Ukraine would be some type of treaty, probably not with NATO, because NATO works by consensus, and there isn't a consensus to extend the Article 5 security guarantee to Ukraine while it's still at war. Or even if the war stopped, we're not sure that there would be such a consensus. So we have to live in the world that we live in. Sure, Ukraine would love to be in NATO, and sure, many officials in NATO have promised Ukraine, but is it feasible? And if it's not feasible, what do we do then? And so some type of security guarantee with the United States would have to be sold to the American people, the same way that the one with South Korea, the one with Japan, the one with Australia, right, is supported by the American people. It would have to be sold by them. That hasn't happened yet.
Right.
But that could also be joined, if it were to happen, by others. This is why I call it bilateral plus. For example, Poland might wish to join. For example, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe one or two of them would like to join. Maybe the Scandinavians would like. So it's a kind of proto version of the fuller NATO, more than just what South Korea has, which is a lot.
The Korean armistice also had a clause, 13D, which restricted a further infusion of weaponry into South Korea that the North and China did not want on its border, and the US made a concession towards. This was overseen by a neutral nation supervisory committee.
But less than the full NATO. So that would be a big step forward. We're not there yet. We would have to prepare the U.S. public and the U.S. Congress, the Senate especially, to ratify a treaty like that. We're far away from that now. But at least let's discuss these terms publicly so that people understand how Ukraine could win the peace.